Chapter 12. He couldn't explain it logically, but from his experience reading novels and watching trashy TV shows, he felt like he had a good idea of the kind of plot device called for now, based on the way the story had unfolded. There was a certain tempo to the unfolding. They hadn't been searching for Sadako's hiding place, but in the blink of an eye they'd stumbled upon the tragedy that had befallen her in the spot where she was buried. So when Ryuji told him to, quote, stop in front of a large hardware store, unquote, Asakawa was relieved. He's thinking the same thing I am. Asakawa still couldn't imagine what a horrible task this would be. Unless it had been completely buried, finding the old well in the vicinity of Villa Log Cabin shouldn't be too difficult. And once they found it, it should be easy to bring up Sadako's remains. It all sounded pretty simple, and he wanted to think it would be. It was 1 in the afternoon. The midday sun reflected brilliantly from the hilly streets in this hot spring resort town. The brightness and the neighborhood's laid-back weekday mood clouded his imagination. It didn't occur to him that even if it were only 4 or 5 meters deep, the bottom of a well was bound to be an entirely different world from the well-lit ground above. Nishizaki Hardware. Asakawa saw the sign and braked. There were stepladders and lawnmowers lined up in front of the store. They should be able to get everything they needed here. I'll let you do the shopping, Asakawa said, running to a nearby phone booth. He paused before entering it to take a phone card from his wallet. Hey, we don't have time to waste on phone calls. But Asakawa wasn't listening. Grumbling, Ryuji went into the store and grabbed rope, a bucket, a shovel, a pulley block, and a high-powered flashlight. Asakawa was desperate. This might be the last chance to hear their voices. He knew full well how little time he had to waste. He only had 9 hours left until his deadline. He slipped the card into the phone and dialed the number of his wife's parents' house in Ashikaga. His father-in-law answered. Hello, it's Asakawa. Could you call Shizu and Yoko to the phone? He knew he was being rude, skipping the customary exchange of pleasantries. But he didn't have time to worry about his father-in-law's feelings. The man started to say something, but then seemed to sense the urgency of the situation and immediately summoned his daughter and granddaughter. Asakawa was extremely glad his mother-in-law hadn't been the one to answer. He'd never have got a word in edgewise then. Hello? Shizu, is that you? Hearing her voice, he missed her already. Where are you? Adami, how's everything there? Oh, about the same. Yoko's having a great time with Grandma and Grandpa. Is she there? He could hear her voice. No words, just sounds as she struggled to climb up on her mother's lap to get to her father. Yoko, it's Daddy. Shizu put the receiver to Yoko's ear. Dada. Dada. He could barely hear the words, if words were there. They were all drowned out by the sounds of her breathing into the phone or rubbing the mouthpiece against her cheek. But these noises only made him feel that much closer to her. He was overcome with a desire to leave all this behind him and hug her. Yoko, you wait there, okay? Daddy's coming soon to get you in the room. Really? When are you getting here? Shizu had taken the phone without him realizing it. On Sunday. Right. I'll be renting a car and driving up, so let's all take a drive into the mountains. To Nico or something. Really? Yoko, isn't that great? Daddy's going to take us for a drive in the car on Sunday. He felt his ears burning. Was he really in a position to make that kind of promise? A doctor was never supposed to say anything to give his patients false hope. He was supposed to do things to minimize the eventual shock as much as possible.
It sounds like you've got this thing you're working on straightened out.
Well, it's coming along.
You promised me that when all this is over, you'd tell me the whole thing from the beginning.
He had promised that. In exchange for her not asking any questions right now, he'd said he'd tell her all about it once it was taken care of. His wife had kept her end of the bargain. Hey, how long are you gonna keep talking? Ryuji said from behind him. Asakawa turned around. Ryuji had the trunk open and was loading his purchases into the car. I'll call again. I might not be able to tonight, though. Asakawa placed his hand on the hook. If he pushed, the connection would be broken. He didn't even know why he'd called. Was it just to hear their voices, or did he have something more important to tell them? But he knew that even if he'd been able to talk to her for an hour, when it came time to hang up, he'd still feel constrained, as if he'd only said half of what he wanted to say. It'd just be the same thing. He pressed down on the hook, and then let go. In any case, everything would be clear tonight at 10. Tonight at 10. Driving up in the daytime like this, South Hakone Pacific Land felt like a typical mountain resort. The creepy mood he'd felt last time he came was hidden by the sunlight. Even the sound of bouncing tennis balls was normal, not sluggish and sonorous like before, but crisp and light. They could see Mount Fuji, hazy and white, and below them in the distance scattered flashes of sun from greenhouse roofs. It was a weekday afternoon, and the villa log cabin appeared deserted. It seemed that the only time the rental units were fully occupied was weekends and the summer vacation season. B4 was vacant today, too. Leaving Ryuji to check in, Asakawa unloaded the car and changed into lighter clothes. He looked carefully around the room. A week ago this evening, Asakawa had fled in fear from this haunted house. He remembered running into the bathroom to throw up, feeling that he was about to piss himself. He could even remember, quite vividly, the graffiti he'd seen on the bathroom wall when he'd knelt down in front of the toilet. Now he opened the bathroom door. The same graffiti in the same place. It was just after 2. They went out onto the balcony and ate the box lunches they'd brought on the way while gazing over the grassy meadow surrounding the cabins. The fretful mood that had shadowed them here from Nagao's clinic subsided a bit. Even amidst the worst panic, there are still scattered moments like this, when time flows leisurely by. Even when trying to finish a story by an impeding deadline, Asakawa would sometimes find himself aimlessly watching coffee drop from the spout of the coffee maker, and later he'd reflect on how elegantly he'd wasted precious time. Eat up. We'll need our strength, said Ryuji. He'd brought 2 lunches just for himself. Asakawa, meanwhile, didn't seem to have much appetite. From time to time, he'd rest his chopsticks and look back inside the cabin. Suddenly, he spoke, as if it had just occurred to him. Maybe we'd better get this straight. What exactly are we doing here? We're going to look for Sadako, of course. And what do we do once we've found her? Take her back to Sashikiji and lay her to rest. So that's the charm. You're saying that's what she wants. Ryuji chewed loudly for a while on a big mouthful of rice, eyes staring straight ahead, unfocused. Asakawa could tell from the look on his face that Ryuji wasn't entirely convinced either. Asakawa was scared. It was his last chance, and he wanted some sort of assurance that they were doing the right thing. There were to be no second chances. There's nothing else we can do now, said Ryuji, tossing away his empty lunchbox. What about this possibility? Maybe she wants us to clear away her resentment toward the person who killed her. You mean Jotaro Nagao? You mean if we exposed him, Sadako would be appeased? Asakawa looked deep into Ryuji's eyes, trying to figure out what he really thought. If they dug up the remains and laid them to rest and it still didn't save Asakawa's life, maybe Ryuji was planning to kill Dr. Nagao. Maybe he was using Asakawa as a test case, trying to save his own skin. Come on, don't be stupid, said Ryuji with a laugh. First of all, if Nagao had really incurred Sadako's resentment, he'd already be dead. True. She definitely had that kind of power. So why did she let herself be killed by him? I can't say. But look, she was surrounded by the deaths of people close to her. She knew nothing but frustration. Even disappearing from the theater company like that was essentially a frustration of her goals, right? Then she visits her father at the sanatorium and finds out that he's near death. A person who's given up on the world harbors no resentment toward the person who takes her out of it. Is that what you're saying? Not exactly. Rather, I think it's possible that Sadako herself caused those impulses in old man Nagao. In other words, she killed herself, but borrowed Nagao's hands to do it. Her mother had thrown herself into a volcano. Her father was dying of tuberculosis. Her own dreams of becoming an actress had been shattered. And then there were her congenital handicaps. She had any number of reasons to commit suicide. And there were things that just didn't add up unless one assumed she'd killed herself. Yoshino's report had mentioned Shigemori, founder of the theater group Soaring. He'd got drunk and dropped in on Sadako, and died the next day of cardiac paralysis. It was almost certain that Sadako had killed him using some abnormal ability of hers. She had that kind of power. She could easily kill a man or two without leaving any evidence. So why was Nagao still alive? It made no sense, unless one decided that she must have guided his will in order to kill herself. Well, okay, let's say it was a suicide. But why did she have to be raped before she died? And don't tell me it's because she didn't want to die a virgin. Asakawa had hit the nail on the head, and as a result, Ryuji was at a loss for an answer. That's exactly what he was going to say. Is that really so stupid? Huh? Is it really so foolish to not want to die a virgin? Ryuji pressed his point with a desperate earnestness. If it were me, if by some chance it were me, that's how I'd feel. I wouldn't want to die a virgin. This wasn't like Ryuji, Asakawa felt. Asakawa couldn't explain it logically, but neither the words nor the facial expressions were like Ryuji at all. Are you serious? Men and women are different, especially in the case of Sadako Yamamura. Just kidding. Sadako didn't want to be raped. Of course she didn't. I mean, who'd want a thing like that to happen to oneself? Plus, she bit Nagao's shoulder down to the bone. It was only after it happened that the thought of dying occurred to her, and without even considering it, she guided Nagao in that direction. I think that's probably what happened. But then, wouldn't you still expect her to have a lingering resentment toward Nagao? Asakawa still wasn't convinced. But aren't you forgetting? We need to imagine the spear tip of her resentment being pointed, not at any one individual, but at society in general. Compared to that, her hatred of Nagao was as insignificant as a fart in a windstorm. If hatred towards society in general was what was incorporated into that video, then what was the charm? What could it be? The phrase, indiscriminate attack, came into Asakawa's mind before Ryuji's thick voice interrupted his thoughts. Enough already. If we have time to think about crap like this, We should be spending it trying to find Sadako. She's the one who'll solve every riddle. Ryuji drained the last of his oolong tea and then stood up and tossed the empty can out toward the valley floor. They stood on the gentle hillside looking around at the tall grass. Ryuji handed Asakawa a sickle and pointed with his chin to the slope on the left side of B4. He wanted him to cut away the tangles of grass and examine the contours of the ground there. Asakawa bent down, dropped his knee, and began to swing the sickle in an arc parallel to the ground. Grass began to fall. 30 years before, a dilapidated house had stood here, with a well in its front yard. Asakawa stood up again. He looked around again, wondering where he'd build his dwelling if he were to live here. He'd probably choose a site with a nice view. There was no other reason to build a house up here. Where was the best view? Eyes trained on the greenhouse roofs shining far below, Asakawa walked around a bit, paying attention to the shifting perspective. The view didn't seem to change much no matter where he went, but he thought that if he were building a house, it would be easier to build it where cabin A4 stood than where B4 was. When he bent down to the ground and looked, he realized that was the only level area. He crawled around in the space between A4 and B4, cutting the grass and feeling the earth with his hands. He had no memory of ever drawing water from a well. He realized that he'd never even seen a real well. He had no idea what one really looked like, especially one in a mountainous area such as this. Was there really groundwater here? But then, a few hundred meters east along the floor of the valley, there was a patch of marsh surrounded by tall trees. Asakawa's thoughts weren't coming together. What was he supposed to concentrate on during a task such as this? No idea. He felt the blood rush to his head. He looked at his watch. Almost 3 o'clock. 7 hours left. Would all this effort get them any closer to meeting the deadline? The thought sent his mind into further disarray. His image of the well was hazy. What would remain to mark the site of an old well? A bunch of stones piled up in a circle? What if they'd collapsed and fallen into the earth? No way. Then they'd never make it in time. He looked at his watch again. Exactly 3 now. He'd just drunk 500 milliliters of oolong tea on the balcony, but already his throat was dry again. Voices echoed in his head. Look for a bulge in the earth. Look for rocks. He jammed the shovel into the exposed dirt. Time and blood assaulted his brain. His nerves were shot, but he didn't feel fatigued. Why was time flowing so differently now than it had on the balcony when they were eating lunch? Why had he started to panic so much the minute he'd set to work? Was this the right thing to do? Really? Weren't there a lot of other things they should be doing? He dug a cave once as a child. He must have been in the 4th or 5th grade. He laughed weakly as he recalled the episode. What in the world are you doing? At the sound of Ryuji's voice, Asakawa's head jerked up. What have you been up to, crawling around over here? We've got to search a wider area. Asakawa gaped up at Ryuji. Ryuji had the sun at his back. His face was shadowy. Drops of sweat from his dark face fell into the grass by his feet. What was I up to? A little hole had been dug in the ground right in front of him. Asakawa hadn't dug it. You digging a pit or something? Ryuji sighed. Asakawa frowned and moved to look at his watch. And stop looking at your fucking watch! Ryuji slapped his hand away. He glared at Asakawa for a little while, then sighed again. He squatted and whispered, calmly. Maybe you want to take a break. No time. I'm telling you, you need to get a hold of yourself. Panicking won't get you anywhere. Asakawa was crouching, too, and Ryuji poked him lightly in the chest. Asakawa lost his balance and fell over backwards, feet up in the air. That's it. Lie down just like that. Just like a baby. Asakawa squirmed, trying to get to his feet. Don't move. Lie down. Don't waste your strength. Ryuji stepped on Asakawa's chest until he stopped struggling. Asakawa closed his eyes and gave up resisting. The weight of Ryuji's foot receded into the distance. When he gently opened his eyes again, Ryuji was moving his short, powerful legs, crossing over into the shade of B4's balcony. His gait was eloquent. He'd had an inspiration as to where they could find the well, and his sense of desperation had faded. After Ryuji had left, Asakawa lay still for a while. Flat on his back, spread-eagled, he gazed up into the sky. The sun was bright. How weak was his spirit compared to Ryuji's? Disgusting. He regulated his breathing and tried to think coolly. He wasn't confident he could keep himself together as the next 7 hours ticked away. He'd just follow Ryuji's every order. That'd be best. Lose himself. Place himself under the sway of someone with an unyielding spirit. Lose yourself. You'll even be able to escape the terror then. You're going to be buried in the earth. You'll become one with nature. As if in answer to his wish, he was suddenly overcome by drowsiness and began to lose consciousness. At the very threshold of sleep, in the midst of a daydream about lifting Yoko high into the air, he remembered once again that episode from his grade school days. There was a municipal sports ground on the outskirts of the town where he'd grown up. There was a cliff at its edge, and at the foot of the cliff was a swamp with crayfish in it. When he was a schoolboy, Asakawa often went there with his buddies to catch crayfish. On that particular day, the sun shining on the exposed red earth of the cliff next to the swamp was like a challenge. He was tired sitting there holding his fishing pole anyway, so he went over to where the sun was shining on the cliff and began to dig a hole in its steep face. The dirt was soft clay, and it crumbled away at his feet when he thrust in an old piece of board he'd found. Before long, his friends joined him. There had been 3 of them, he seemed to recall, or maybe 4. Just the perfect number for digging a cave. Any more and they would have been bumping heads. Any fewer and it would have been too much work for each of them. After an hour of digging, they'd made a hole just the right size for one of them to crawl into. They kept going. They'd originally been on their way home from school, and soon one of his friends said he had to be getting home. Only Asakawa, whose idea it had been in the first place, kept at it silently. And by the time the sun set, the cave had grown large enough for all the boys who were left to squeeze into. Asakawa had hugged his knees. He and his friends giggled at each other. Curled up in the red clay like that, they felt like the Stone Age people at Mikabi, whose remains they'd just learned about in social studies. However, after a little while, the entrance to the hole was blocked by a lady's face. The setting sun was at her back, so her face was in shadow and they couldn't make out her expression, but they realized it was a 50-ish housewife from the neighborhood. What are you boys doing digging a hole here? It'd be pretty disgusting if you got buried alive in there, the lady said, peering into the cave. Asakawa and the 2 other boys exchanged glances. Young though they were, they still noticed something odd about her warning. Not, cut it out, that's dangerous, but cut it out, because if you got buried alive in there and died, it would be disgusting to the people in the neighborhood, such as me. She was cautioning them purely for her own good. Asakawa and his friends began to giggle again. The lady's face blocked the entrance like a figure in a shadow play. Ryuji's face gradually superimposed itself over the lady's. Now you're a bit too relaxed. Imagine being able to go night-night in a place like this. Hey, you jerk, what are you giggling at? Ryuji woke him up. The sun was nearing the western horizon, and darkness was fast approaching. Ryuji's face and figure against the weakening sunlight were even blacker than before. Come over here a minute. Ryuji pulled Asakawa to his feet, and then silently crawled back under the balcony of B4. Asakawa followed. Under the balcony, one of the boards between the supporting pillars had been peeled partway back. Ryuji stuck his hand in between the board and pulled it out with all his might. With a loud snap, the board broke in half diagonally. The decor inside the cabin was modern, but these boards were so flimsy that you could break them by hand. The builders had thoroughly skimped on the parts you couldn't see. Ryuji poked a flashlight inside and shined it around under the cabin. He nodded as if to say, "Come look at this." Asakawa fixed his gaze on the gap in the wall and looked inside. The flashlight beam was trained on a black protrusion over by the west side. As he stared at it, he noticed that the side seemed to have an uneven texture, like a pile of rocks. The top was covered with a concrete lid. Blades of grass poked out of cracks in the concrete and between the stones. Asakawa immediately realized what was directly overhead: the living room of the cabin, and directly over the round rim of the well were the television and VCR. A week ago, when he'd watched that video, Sadako Yamamoto had been this close, hiding, watching what went on above. Ryuji pulled off more boards until there was an opening large enough for a man to pass through. They both ducked through the hole in the wall and crawled to the rim of the well. The cabin was built on a gradient, and they'd entered from the downhill end, so the further they went, the lower the floorboards got, creating a sense of something pressing down on them. Even though there should be plenty of air in the dark crawl space, Asakawa began to find it hard to breathe. The soil here was clammier than outside. Asakawa knew full well what they must do now. He knew, but he felt no fear yet. He felt claustrophobic just from the floorboards over his head, but maybe he'd have to go down into the bottom of the well, into a place ruled by an even deeper darkness. Not maybe. To pull Sadako out, they'd almost certainly have to descend into the well. Not maybe. To pull Sadako out, they'd almost certainly have to descend into the well. "Give me a hand here," said Ryuji. He'd grabbed a piece of rebar poking out from a crack in the concrete lid and was trying to pull the lid out onto the downhill slope. But the ceiling was too low, and he couldn't get much leverage. Even someone like Ryuji, who could bench 120 kilos, was down to half strength if he didn't have the right footing. Asakawa went around the well until he was uphill from it and lay down on his back. He placed both hands on a support column to brace himself and then pushed against the lid with his feet. There was an ugly sound as the concrete scraped against stone. Asakawa and Ryuji began to chant in order to synchronize their efforts. The lid moved. How many years had it been since the well's face was exposed? Had the well been capped when Villa Log Cabin was built, or when Pacific Land was established, or when the sanatorium closed? They could only guess, based on the strength of the seal between the concrete and the stones. On the almost human screech as the lid was torn away. Probably more than just 6 months or a year, but no longer than 25 years. In any case, the well had now started to open its mouth. Ryuji stuck the blade of the shovel into the space they'd made so far and pushed. "Okay, When I give the signal, I want you to lean on the handle. Asakawa turned around. Ready? 1, 2, 3, push! As Asakawa leaned on the makeshift lever, Ryuji pushed on the side of the cap with both hands. With an agonized shriek, the lid fell to the ground. The lip of the well was faintly damp. Asakawa and Ryuji picked up their flashlights, placed their other hands on the wet rim, and pulled themselves up. Before shining light into the well, they moved their heads and shoulders into the roughly 50-centimeter gap between the top of the well and the floor above. A putrid smell arose on the cold air. The space inside the well was so dense that they felt if they let go their hands, they'd be sucked in. She was here, all right. This woman with extraordinary supernatural power, with testicular feminization syndrome. Woman wasn't even the right word. The biological distinction between male and female depended on the structure of the gonads. No matter how beautifully feminine the body, if those gonads were in the form of testes, it was male. Asakawa didn't know whether he should consider Sadako Yamamura a man or a woman. Since her parents had named her Sadako, it seemed they had intended to raise her as a woman. This morning, on the boat to Atami, Ryuji had said, "Don't you think a person with both male and female genitals is the ultimate symbol of power and beauty?" Come to think of it, Asakawa had once seen something in an art book that had made him doubt his eyes. A perfectly mature female nude was reclining on a slab of stone, with a splendid example of the male genitalia peeking out from between her thighs. "Can you see anything?" asked Ryuji. The beams of their flashlights showed that water had collected in the bottom of the well, about 4 or 5 meters down, but they didn't know how deep the water was. "There's water down there." Ryuji scuffled around, tying the end of a rope to a post. "Okay. Point your flashlight downward and hold it over the edge. Don't drop it, whatever you do." "He's planning to go down in there." As he realized this, Asakawa's legs began to shake. "What if I have to go down?" Now, finally, with the narrow vertical tunnel staring him in the face, Asakawa's imagination started to work on him. "I can't do it. Go into that black water and do what? Fish around for bones, that's what. There's no way I can do that. I'll go crazy." As he gratefully watched Ryuji lower himself into the hole, he prayed to God that his turn would never come. His eyes were accustomed to the dark now, and he could see the moss covering the inner surface of the well. The stones of the wall and the orange beam of his flashlight seemed to turn into eyes and noses and mouths, and when he couldn't tear his gaze away, the patterns of the stones transformed into dead faces, distorted with demonic cries at their moment of death. Innumerable evil spirits undulated like seaweed, hands outstretched toward the exit. He couldn't drive away the image. A pebble fell into the ghastly shaft, barely a meter across, echoed against the sides of the well, and was swallowed into the gullets of the evil spirits. "Hey, Asakawa! Go get the bucket! Oh, and the thin rope, too." The bucket was where they'd left it, on the balcony. Asakawa crawled out from underneath the cabin. It was dark outside, but it still felt far brighter than under the foundation. What a feeling of release. So much pure air. He looked around at the cabins. Only A1, by the road, emitted any light. He made a point of not looking at his watch. The warm, friendly voices spilling from A1 seemed to constitute a separate world, floating in the distance. They were the sounds of dinner time. He didn't have to look at his watch to know what time it must be. He returned to the lip of the well, where he tied the bucket and shoveled to the end of the rope and lowered them down. Ryuji shoveled earth from the bottom of the well into the bucket. From time to time, he'd crouch and run his fingers through the mud, searching for something, but he didn't find anything. "Haul the bucket up," he shouted. With his belly braced against the edge of the well, Asakawa pulled up the bucket, then dumped the mud and rocks out on the ground before lowering the empty bucket back down into the well. It seemed that quite a bit of dirt and sand had drifted into the well before it had been sealed. Ryuji dug and dug, but without turning up Sadako's beautiful limbs. "Hey, Asakawa." Ryuji paused in his labors and looked up. Asakawa didn't reply. "Asakawa! Something wrong up there?" Asakawa wanted to reply, "Nothing's wrong. I'm fine." "You haven't said a word this whole time. At least, call out encouragement or something. I'm getting a bit melancholy down here." Asakawa said nothing. "Well, then, how about a song? Something by Hibari Misora, maybe." Asakawa still said nothing. "Hey! Asakawa, are you still there? I know you didn't faint on me." I'm fine," he managed to mutter. "You're a pain in the ass, that's what you are." Ryuji spat out the words and jammed the tip of the shovel into the water. How many times had he done this now? The water level was slowly dropping, but still there were no signs of what they were looking for. He could see the bucket climbing more and more slowly. Then, finally, it stopped. Asakawa let it slip out of his hands. He'd had it raised about half the height of the well, and now it plunged back down again. Ryuji managed to avoid a direct hit, but he got splashed from head to toe with muddy water. Along with anger came the realization that Asakawa was at the limit of his strength. "Son of a bitch! Are you trying to kill me?" Ryuji climbed up the rope. "Your turn." "My turn?" Shocked, Asakawa stood up, banging his head hard on the floorboards in the process. "Wait, Ryuji, it's okay. I'm all right. I've still got some strength left," Asakawa stammered. Ryuji poked his hand out of the well. "No, you haven't. Not an ounce. Your turn." Just hold on. Let me catch my second wind. We'd be here till dawn." Ryuji shined the light in Asakawa's face. There was a strange look in his eyes. Fear of death had stolen his reason. One look told Ryuji that Asakawa was no longer capable of rational judgment. Between shoveling muddy water into a bucket and hauling that bucket 4 or 5 meters straight up, it didn't take much to see which was the harder job. "Down you go." Ryuji pushed Asakawa toward the well. "No, wait, it's..." "What?" "I'm claustrophobic." "Don't be silly." Asakawa continued to cringe, unmoving. The water at the bottom of the well trembled slightly. "I can't do it. I can't go down there." Ryuji grabbed Asakawa by the collar and slapped him twice. "Snap out of it. I can't go down there. You've got death staring you in the face, and you might be able to do something about it. And now you say you can't do it? Don't be a worm. It's not just your own life at stake here, you know. Remember that phone call? You ready to take sweet babykins down into the darkness with you?" He thought about his wife and daughter. He couldn't afford to be a coward. He held their lives in his hands, but his body wouldn't obey him. Is this really going to work, though? But there was no purpose in his voice. He knew it was pointless to even ask the question now. Ryuji relaxed his grip on his collar. "Shall I tell you a little more about Professor Mayura's theory? There are 3 conditions that have to be met in order for a malevolent will to remain in the world after death: an enclosed space, water, and a slow death. 1, 2, 3. In other words, if someone dies slowly in an enclosed space with water present, then usually that person's angry spirit will haunt the place. Now, look at this well. It's a small, enclosed space. There's water. And remember what the old lady in the video said. How has your health been since then? If you spend all your time playing in the water, monsters are bound to get you. Playing in the water. That was it. Sadako was down there, under that black, muddy water, playing, even now. An endless, watery underground game. You see, Sadako was still alive when she was dropped into this well. And while she waited for death, she coated the very walls with her hatred. All three conditions were met in her case. So, according to Professor Miura, it's easy to exercise such a curse. We just free her. We take her bones out of this nasty old well, have a nice memorial service, and lay her to rest in the soil of her native place. We bring her up into the wide, bright world. A while before, when he'd crawled out from under the cabin to get the bucket, Asakawa had felt an indescribable sense of liberation. Were they supposed to provide Sadako with the same thing? Was that what she wanted? So that's the charm. Maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. That's pretty vague. Ryuji grabbed Asakawa's collar again. Think. There's nothing certain in our future. All we can hope for is a vague continuation. But in spite of that, you're going to keep on living. You can't give up on life just because it's vague. It's a question of possibilities. The charm. There might be a lot of other things Sadako wants, but there's a good possibility that taking her remains out of here will break the curse of the video. Asakawa twisted his face and screamed silently. Enclosed space, water, and a slow death, he says. Those three conditions allow the strongest survival of an evil spirit, he says. Where's the proof that anything that Fraud Mieta said is true? If you understand me, you'll go down into the well. But I don't understand. How can I understand something like this? You don't have time to dawdle. Your deadline is almost here. Ryuji's voice grew gradually kinder. Don't think you can overcome death with a fight. Asshole, I don't want to hear your philosophy of life. But he finally began to climb over the rim of the well. Attaboy, you finally think you can do it. Asakawa clung to the rope and lowered himself down the inner wall of the well. Ryuji's face was before his eyes. Don't worry. There's nothing down there. Your biggest enemy is your imagination. When he looked up, the beam of the flashlight hit him full in the face, blinding him. He pressed his back against the wall. His grip on the rope began to loosen. His feet slipped against the stones, and he suddenly dropped about a meter. His hands burned from the friction. He was dangling just above the surface of the water, but couldn't make himself go in. He extended one foot, putting it in the water up to his ankle as if he were testing the temperature of a bath. With the cold touch of the water came goose flesh, from the tips of his toes to his spine, and he immediately retracted his foot. But his arms were too tired to keep hanging onto the rope. His weight pulled him slowly down, and eventually he couldn't endure any more, so he planted both feet. Immediately, the soft dirt below the water enveloped his feet, submerging them. Asakawa still clung to the rope in front of his eyes. He started to panic. He felt as if a forest of hands were reaching up from the earth to pull him into the mud. The walls were closing in on all sides, leering at him. There's no escape. Ryuji! He tried to scream, but he couldn't find his voice. He couldn't breathe. Only a faint, dry sound escaped his throat, and he looked upward like a drowning child. He felt something warm trickle down the insides of his thighs. Asakawa! Breathe! Overcome by the pressure, Asakawa had forgotten to breathe. It's all right. I'm here. Ryuji's voice echoed down to him, and Asakawa managed to suck in a lungful of air. He couldn't control the pounding of his heart. He couldn't do what he needed to down there. He desperately tried to think of something else. Something more pleasant. If this well had been outside, under a sky full of stars, it wouldn't be this horrible. It was because it was covered by cabin B4 that it was so hard to take. It cut off the escape route. Even with the concrete lid gone, there were only floorboards and spider webs above. Sadako Yamamura has lived down here for 25 years. That's right. She's down here, right under my feet. This is a tomb. That's what it is. A tomb. He couldn't think of anything else. Thought itself was closed off to him, as was any kind of escape. Sadako had tragically ended her life down here, and the scenes that had flashed through her mind at her moment of death had remained here, still strong, through the power of her psyche. And they'd matured down here in this cramped hole, breathing like the ebb and flow of the tide, waxing and waning in strength according to some cycle that had at some point coincided in frequency with the television placed directly overhead, and then they'd made their appearance in the world. Sadako was breathing. From out of nowhere, the sound of breathing enclosed him. Sadako Yamamura. Sadako Yamamura. The syllables repeated themselves in his brain, and her terrifyingly beautiful face came to him out of the photographs, shaking her head coquettishly. Sadako Yamamura was here. Asakawa recklessly began to dig through the earth beneath him, searching for her. He thought of her pretty face and her body, trying to maintain that image. That beautiful girl's bones, covered in my piss. Asakawa moved the shovel, sifting through the mud. Time no longer mattered. He'd taken off his watch before coming down here. Extreme fatigue and stress had deadened his vexation, and he forgot the deadline he was laboring under. It felt like being drunk. He had no sense of time. Only by the frequency with which the bucket came back and down the well to him, and by the beating of his heart, did he have any way of measuring time. Finally, Asakawa grasped a large, round rock with both hands. It was smooth and pleasant to the touch, with 2 holes in its surface. He lifted it out of the water. He washed the dirt out of its recesses. He picked it up by what must once have been ear holes and found himself face to face with a skull. His imagination clothed it with flesh. Big, clear eyes returned to the deep, hollow sockets, and flesh appeared above the 2 holes in the middle, forming itself into an elegant nose. Her long hair was wet, and water dripped from her neck and from behind her ears. Sadako Yamamura blinked her melancholy eyes 2 or 3 times to shake the water from her eyelashes. Squeezed between Asakawa's hands, her face looked painfully distorted. But still, her beauty was unclouded. She smiled at Asakawa, then narrowed her eyes as if to focus her vision. I've been wanting to meet you. As he thought this, Asakawa slumped down right where he was. He could hear Ryuji's voice from far overhead. Asakawa! Wasn't your deadline 10:04? Rejoice! It's 10:10! Asakawa! Can you hear me? You're still alive, right? The curse is broken! We're saved! Hey, Asakawa! If you die down there, you'll end up just like her. If you die, just don't put a curse on me, okay? If you're going to die, die nice, would you?
Hey, Asakawa! If you're still alive, answer me, damn it!
He heard Ryuji, but he didn't really feel saved. He just curled up as if in a dream, as if in another world, clutching Sadako Yamamoto's skull to his chest.